As you know, my paper was on trade-related risk data marketplaces. And actually, I'm going to tell you the story of why we wanted to explore this area. There's a hedge fund that a couple of years ago said, well, why do I pay 100 quants within my company to crunch my data and to elaborate the model for that, when I can basically figure out mathematical ways and then marketplace ways to tap into the world's market for data scientists. And they built a couple of stuff, and the models were not great initially, but very quickly they reached a stage where they had 10,000 data scientists crunching their data. And of course, they didn't really want to expose the data, so they put a homomorphic transformation of their data before exposing it outside. And of course, as well, 90% of the data scientists outside were not as good as the quants they had before, but the top percentile was way better than what they were able to afford initially. And then they moved to a second stage where they started creating measures for the added value of each contribution to the model by each data scientist, creating a sort of meta model and trying to accurately measure who should be rewarded what. And step by step, it became a marketplace for models provided by anybody who can get rewarded as long as his contribution continues to be used in the meta model. And I thought this was very inspiring, but of course, it only worked with a very well identified source of data controlled by one party, exposing it to a community of data scientists. And when I look at the issue we try to solve, the source of data is distributed everywhere. It is basically somewhere in the systems of every SME anywhere. And the skills to interpret this data is, well, we don't really know. And we just know that the current trade finance providers, supply chain finance providers, credit insurers have models that don't work particularly well for small companies. But we believe that if we combine the same sort of bricks as this hedge fund I mentioned before built, we have a chance to address the issue. Now, to build those, we have 2 or 3 separate set of problems in a way. How can we, first, how can we build a marketplace that gets traction? And this is always an issue, of course, especially in a topic where trust is so important, because of course SMEs will not give the data unless they're completely sure that their neighbor competitor will not be able to access this data either. Second, how can we help multiple parties enrich a sort of common data set so that the data contributed by company A can be put next to the data contributed by company B and can be perhaps enriched with a third data set, all of that being encrypted and not needing decryption, and still being able to merge correctly those data sets. And the third problem is one where as soon as this system would get traction, of course there would hopefully be bigger companies that would want to participate, and those companies would probably not really want their data to ever leave their premises. First, because sometimes they're subject to regulation that don't allow that, and second, because perhaps they got still some trust issues with the system. And so the third issue we get is to imagine the system with a capability to run the algorithm in a local manner, in a way. So basically using sort of distributed training of models or hybrid distributed and non-distributed computing of models so that each company could train the models on their own premises. And this combined with the point I mentioned before, that these data sets should be assembled as needed, that makes the problem pretty complex. And because I come from the world of making innovation happen, my particular sensitivity of this issue is not really the scientific problems that this has intrinsically, although there are big challenges and we don't really know how all of them will be solved, but more in terms of how do we make sure that we create adoption for that. Because if we figure it out scientifically speaking, but then have no uses for that, it won't be of much use. And so we're currently looking for the first steps in where we can get adoption. And it seems as if the answer seems to be in communities that are really underserved in terms of credit. You mentioned supply chain finance before in your paper, and it's a very interesting space because there's lots of data, and usually as soon as you get access to data, it's trillions of transactions, dollar value. We are actually looking at the exact opposite of that. We're looking at the freelancer space and think that there might be the less sensitive type of companies willing to expose the data in exchange for value-added services. Because if you're a fairly large company today, or if you're part of an integrated supply chain, then you might still get somewhere some services from banks or from alternative providers, although they might not really be perfect for what you need. But if you're a freelancer today, then it's actually super hard to get finance or to get credit, or even simply to get paid by your client. And so for now, and it's after we wrote the paper, but the first angle we're trying to get to is to figure out the value proposition that will help freelancers expose their data. And we looked at a couple of freelancer platforms in Europe where, as you know, there's GDPR very well in place already. And it's interesting because in addition to GDPR, those platforms have actually made it one of their value to never share the data of their client freelancers with anybody else. And so it immediately forces us into a model where the models we need to train need to run either within the platform that serves the freelancers, or even more interestingly, directly on some sort of computer that the freelancer owns, and where he would not only reuse the data that he shares with the platform, but perhaps some additional data sets. And then we fall to another problem, which is how do we trust the data that each individual would make available for those models to run? And so I'm basically summarizing a huge pile of problems, but for something that we think has a very nice business concretization later on if we manage to solve it. Because if I take the example of those freelancers, basically they're going to be able to get financing from a bunch of players, from banks in particular, who cannot currently, because of Basel III, finance those players. And next to that, it might be the same recipe to unlock at the other end of the spectrum, the supply chains that are currently not financed, not insured. And they might sound like they do not need it, but for example, the diamond supply chain is not financed today because it's deemed too risky, because there's too much asymmetry of information. But actually with a system that would help any participant to unlock their piece of data that they have on the supply chain, it might actually work. So that's why we're fighting for that. Thank you. Yeah, we did look into that a little bit, and whether certain innovators in this space as well could be data providers for us. But more fundamentally speaking, the part of the issue that we're more sensitive to is the lack of historical data of who paid who on time or not, and what made some of the intermediaries go bankrupt. And this kind of data, because it's an industry that has not received financing from structured players, it's more like the uncle finances a little bit that and that and that. There's no track record of the data. So starting to finance that makes everybody scared on the finance side or on the insurance side. And so we're trying to liberate bigger amounts of data in one go in order to calibrate a first model and then to present the case to the credit insurer who's backing that and to funders. But indeed, they seem to be, I mean, because those providers have tried to put traceability on the diamonds industry, it has started to create some sort of best practices of data sharing within the industry. So we want to learn from the process they used to convince the players to do that and to reuse the same strategy. But of course, the issue of fraud in this industry was an even bigger one. They feel that they have survived without financing. But now that they are able to fight fraud, then it becomes even more interesting. Any question? Well, we look for partners, so if there is interest on this field, we think we'll be able to unlock interesting data sets and might not have all the capabilities to leverage all that. So if there is interest on your side to help us make more sense of that, we'll be very interested to hear from you. Thank you very much.